Hi, I'm Donna Vogler. I'm a college professor at SUNY Oneonta in central New York, and I made this very short video to show you or teach you 10 bog plants. I like going out to wetlands, both as part of my work, but also because I enjoy them so much. They're a fun group to know, and as soon as the weather clears, I encourage you to get out there and see some. First, I want to teach you sphagnum peat moss as well as leatherleaf, so I'll be doing these pairs at a time. Peat moss is the same peat moss that you buy in the hardware store if you want to add some peat to your soil, but this is the living version of it that grows very avidly in bogs. There's a lot of different species of sphagnum. Some are very rare and sort of hard to find, others fairly common. They do like wet, saturated areas, and they're actually part of the underpinnings of a quaking bog. That is, when you're walking through a bog, in part, you're walking a lot on peat moss. As the peat moss dies, it starts to partially decompose, but then decomposition slows down and just layer after layer after layer of dead sphagnum turns into peat moss, which is what they harvest and put into bags for landscaping. On the right is leatherleaf, which is a shrubby plant, and it gets its name because the leaves that it has are quite leathery. They're a bit pliable and tough. It's a shrub, so it has a little bit of a woody stem, but it's not a very tall plant, maybe a meter at best. It forms a little root network that goes between the sphagnum peat moss, and so the typical presentation that you would find is a layer of peat moss with some amount of this leatherleaf growing through it. The leatherleaf roots hold the whole mat together, so even if there's not a boardwalk, in some cases you could actually walk out onto the bog without falling through thanks to the leatherleaf. The next pair are really endemic or iconic species of bogs, and these are both carnivorous plants. The pitcher plant is to the left. This is the one that has a modified leaf. The leaf has water, or at least it captures some amount of rainwater, but it also secretes certain kinds of juices and enzymes from the plant itself. The inside part of the leaf has little hairs that all point down. So if a hapless fly should come in and start to investigate it, it's easy for it to crawl down, but it's much harder for it to crawl back up. And once it hits the water, it has a surfactant like soap suds that makes the fly drown pretty instantly within the confines of the pitcher. What it's doing for the plant is the plant can do photosynthesis. It can live on its own without the insects, but the insects provide valuable nitrogen that's very hard to get in bogs. And so pitcher plants and sundew have at least partial carnivory to at least get some of their nutritional needs. On the middle photo, I am pointing to a round leaf sundew. And in fact, if it's not otherwise indicated, I took all of these pictures and I've given credit to the ones, say, on the inset where it was not my own photo. My camera couldn't get close enough to show the really nice round leaf of this round leaf sundew, and in fact there are different species of sundew throughout New York, but they all work in pretty much the same way. As an insect lands on those little sticky hairs, they, like the pitcher plant, start to break down the insect. Basically, the insect dies there, and it leaks out its nitrogen. Now, the round leaf sundew will sometimes curl around the insect over some time, but this is not like those Venus flytraps where it snaps very suddenly. This is kind of a slow acting thing. But sundews are very tiny. They're always very tiny plants. Pitcher plants will be the much larger. So if you see a pitcher plant, you should also start looking around for a sundew because they grow in the same areas. Cranberries and blueberries are two really nice fruiting plants of the bog. Cranberries and blueberries are both grown commercially using kind of acidic soils that are typical of bogs. Here I'm pointing to a nice little cluster of cranberries. There's a couple of species. There's a small flowered cranberry and a large flowered cranberry, but they both produce berries of fairly large, easy to pick size. Cranberries are like the leatherleaf, a little woody, a little sort of viney, and can actually grow through the sphagnum peat moss, so it helps hold the whole peat moss mat more or less together. Birds and deer and everybody like all of these plants. So sometimes it's a real race to get to the fruits before something else does. But you'll note how very tiny the leaves are along that vine. So again, they lay pretty close to the soil. Sometimes they'll branch up a little bit. But these are another ones that's hard to see unless it's in fruit. Blueberry, there's several species in New York. There's a low bush cranberry, which is what this is. There's high bush cranberry, which is a much taller plant, but they produce the edible blueberries, beloved by deer and other species. So again, you have to fight your way to them. It's hard to find blueberries with really large, easy-to-eat blueberries unless it's more or less in the sun. So these plants tend to grow in the shade as well as the sun, but only if it's in the sort of more open areas where you see this nice fruit as they have here. Interestingly enough, these two plants are in the same genus. They're rather closely related, even though they don't look very similar, but you will find them both in bogs. Blueberries more on the edge, cranberries in the wettest central parts. Here's two of my favorites. The one on the left is cotton grass. It is not a grass, it's a member of a very large family, the sedge family, but it's graminoid-like, and that's how it gets its name. But obviously that cotton top is really why it's called cotton grass. There's even several species of cotton grass. This one I believe is the tawny cotton grass, but these are more common and more abundant the further north you go. So if you go to northern Canada or into Alaska, you'll see large boggy areas that are filled with cotton grass, and it's pretty typical of those areas. I like it because this grass really only grows on bogs. You don't really find it much elsewhere. And so when you see the cotton grass out there blowing, you really know that you are in a bog. On the right is probably the best photo I ever took. Mine tend to be out of focus, but I actually got this one straight on. This is a grass pink, which is an orchid. Now, it's not as large as maybe the photo would indicate. It's probably only maybe 3 inches across. It grows in a cluster of 3 or 4 flowers that bloom, and then the next one takes over, and the next one takes over. Grass pinks are endemic to bogs, but they're one of the more common orchids. There are many, many other orchids that are rare. Some are endangered. Some are much harder to find and grow in lower abundances. They're greenish colored and it's hard to see. So you might not appreciate that when you see a grass pink, it's very likely there are some other orchids that are not as spectacular out amongst the vegetation. You should not be picking any orchid. In fact, you shouldn't be picking any species that you find in the bog, because part of all of these plants is that it takes such a long time to grow under these conditions that if you even remove some of the flowers, it's going to take a lot of energy of these plants to reproduce that particular appendage. And last but not least are two plants that you'll find in the wet areas or the aquatic part of a bog. Most bogs have a central water area, and in some cases there's channel or edges or moats around the bogs. It's likely that you'll find both of these plants growing not just nearby, but sometimes one right through the other. So the picture on the top shows a Bladderwort, the yellow flower, growing up and through the water shield, which is the football-shaped leaves. Those are the leaves that you see on the surface on the photo on the left. They are a floating-leaved plant, that is, they're rooted down below into the soil and the muck, and as the stem goes up to the leaves, it becomes covered with this really sticky, mucilaginous goo that if someone sees these leaves and tries to pick them, your hands will be slimed. And that probably keeps a lot of insects or herbivores off the leaf, or off the stalk. But the leaf, you can see, has been riddled here by leaf miners and other kinds of insects, and it's part of the big food chain in a bog. The bladderwort is like the sundew and the pitcher plant, a carnivorous plant. It has really tiny filiform leaves under the water, and it lives most of the time under the water. That is, it doesn't float like the water shield does. But in the tips of these leaves are little bladders, hence its name, that if an insect, particularly a small little zooplankton or a tiny little crustacean, hits that bladder, it triggers a hair that opens and sucks in the water around it. So if the insect is small enough, it gets sucked into the bladder, and like the pitcher plant leaf, once they get in, they can't get out. The insect dies, the plant absorbs some of its nitrogen, and therefore gets by on that. The bladderwort and the water shield are very tolerant of acidic waters, and that's one of the characteristics of bogs is they have a very low pH. And so they can tolerate it where few others can. So when you see these plants, particularly both of these together, you're probably pretty close to a bog. So in closing, here's your final exam. In this picture, you should be able to see pretty easily 4 different species that we've covered, and if you look closely enough, you'll find the 5th one. So the easiest one to find, I think, is the sundew that's almost in the center at the lower half. You can see the round leaves. Growing through it is the woody parts of the leatherleaf, and there's a young set of leatherleaf leaves that are on the right side of the picture. In the background is the pitcher plants, and these are young pitcher plants just forming their pitchers early in the spring. And patterned throughout all of that is the sphagnum moss. And this is typically how you see bog plants presented. Rarely is it a single species patch of this or that. They tend to grow in this network of species intermixed with each other and taking advantage of the same habitats. The cranberry is the hardest one to see. It's on the lower left, a little out of focus and just growing across the top. But again, these are ones that typically grow together. So now you know at least 10 species to work with. I encourage you to go out to the nearest bog near you, take a walk, and learn some of these bog species and enjoy them as much as I do. Thank you.